Hi, this is Brian J. Jones. I'm the author of George Lucas A Life. It's the book that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. And you're listening to Followers of the Force podcast.
Welcome, guys, to a very special episode of the Followers of the Force podcast. Today, we're speaking with the author of George Lucas A Life, a biography on the one and only George Lucas. This book is honestly one of the best biographies I've ever read, if not the best. And Brian J. Jones has also written a biography on Washington Irving, Jim Henson, and last year's Dr. Seuss. So if you haven't read any of his work, and especially haven't read George Lucas A Life, since this is a Star Wars podcast, you've got time now. You can go and read it, get on Audible, get it, wherever it's being sold, just go get it and read it, because the stories in here, getting up close and personal with the person that George Lucas is and was in his early days, it's a real treat. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Brian J. Jones. It's really fun, very insightful into how he got this book written and what was included, and we talk Star Wars. It's really, really, really fun, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So I'll shut up now and let us talk. It's about an hour and change, so just sit back, relax, and may the Force be with you always. I reread this book this week, and I forgot how engrossing it is. I finished it in just like 3 days. And, first, I want to ask you, how did you get into Star Wars? And it's the first question I always ask anybody I interview, because it's always such an interesting story.
Yeah, sure. So I am Generation 1.0 for Star Wars. I was 9 when Star Wars came out. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty much the target audience for Star Wars. Now, I grew up in Albuquerque, which is where I am right now, and we didn't have it in May. I think it opened here maybe in July, and I believe I saw it once in July and then saw it at my birthday's in August, and I believe I saw it again for my birthday at the same time, and it was unheard of for my mother to let us see movies more than once. And I actually ended up seeing Star Wars 7 times in the theater when it first came out. So, I wish I could remember sitting down in the theater the first time and watching it and telling you what theater it was here and being one of those experiences. I don't, but I'll never forget seeing the trailer for it. Because first of all, if you go back and rewatch that trailer, it's a little cheesy and kind of ham-handed in a way. I mean, it's like the way 1970s trailers looked, but very odd. And you can't really tell what's going on. It almost seems like a scary movie. Mm-hmm. And then at one point, R2-D2 falls over and the audience laughed. We weren't sure what to make of it. So I remember seeing that as a kid and being like, what in the world is this? And it was spaceships that were dirty and not new, which was unheard of in science fiction. So, So it's one of these things I'll never forget that trailer, the feeling of that trailer, because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was going to be a scary movie, if it was going to be a funny movie. So I could not wait to see it when it came out.
Yeah, you're the first person who's mentioned the trailer over the actual movie, and it's so cool because I often watch those old trailers. Just when I'm feeling okay, I remember the prequel trailers, but let me see what the original trilogy trailers look like. And yeah, you mentioned how it's just very fast and the sound effects are very loud, and it was just a lot of stuff coming at you.
Yeah, there was the line the line I never forget is they say something like it's a story of a boy, a girl, and a villain.
Yeah.
Vader turns and again, I remember as a 9-year-old, I was like, oh, whoa, what is that? I just didn't know what to make of that movie.
Right. Yeah, and my dad, he was 12 years old when Star Wars came out, so he has a very vivid memory of the same thing everybody says, that Star Destroyer coming overhead at the beginning of the film. And he, to this day, he says that was like the most incredible thing that anybody had seen up to that point. And reading those accounts of fans and just the frenzy of people outside the theater waiting to see that movie, it reminds me of, I guess, my experience with The Force Awakens in 2015, which is the closest thing I've come to probably that day. But I want to ask you, you were introduced to Star Wars at 9 years old. When were you really inspired to become a writer?
Well, so it's one of those things. Like, even as a 9-year-old, my brother and I have a brother who's 2.5, almost 3 years younger than I am, and like we wrote and drew our own comics the entire time growing up as kids, and like we even drew our own adaptation of Star Wars, which is so awful because it's impossible to draw the hardware. Yeah. Without reference, especially, and then you try to remember the plot of it, and you can't quite remember, and you get stuff wrong. So I, my brother and I, we used to write and draw our own comics, and then I was an English major in college and worked for the college newspaper, but I was more on the production side. So, but as an English major, we all fancy ourselves great American frustrated novelists, and I dabbled in fiction at one point, and I was just god awful at it. There's a great story that Ringo Starr tells about how, he would go into Lennon and McCartney and he would start playing them and singing the song that he had written. And they would say, you do know that that's Sentimental Journey. Like, and as he said, he's like, and I found I had rewritten another classic. So that's kind of what happened to me when I started trying to write fiction. People would read it and they'd be like, this is the plot of, some famous novel that, like, I was like, oh God, I guess so. So I was not a great fiction writer. But as I discovered through my first real job out of college, I was a congressional staffer, and your job there involves doing lots of research and, going to a lot of different sources for information and compressing it down and telling a story and advising your member, with 1 or 2 page document. That actually turned out to be really great practice for biography, though I didn't quite know at the moment. But what I found out better was I was a much better explainer than I was a maker, somebody who made it up. So that was. You sort of, as they say, play to your strength. And so I thought I was a much better biographer than I was ever a novelist or anything like that.
Right. Now, when did you know that you wanted, being a biographer to be your career? Did that happen after you graduated or maybe a little farther down the road?
No, it happened a little further down the road. I mean, again, it's one of those things that when you're as an English major, you're always fancying at some point you're going to write something.
Yeah.
And I'd been out of college about 10 years, and I sort of got interested in Washington Irving. I'm not gonna bog down a Star Wars conversation and talking about Washington Irving.
No, you're good.
I'm interested in Washington Irving and reading some of his stuff because I'm a huge Christmas junkie, and Irving is sort of the father of our version of Christmas, which I never knew. So I wanted to read more about him, and there wasn't anything out there. So I was like, well, that's a book I want to read. So I figured out how to write it. And so I started writing that book in maybe 2000. I was researching it a long time because I didn't know what I was doing. But finally wrote it in 2006, 7, and 8. And I was actually still working full time. I've always had a full-time job almost the entire time I've been writing biography. So I wrote my first biography because it was a book I wanted to read. And when that book came out, I hadn't really thought about doing another one. And I somehow ended up on Jim Henson's Wikipedia page and went, why isn't there a biography of Jim Henson? And got into that project, which was a 5-year project at that point. And then when that book was done, there's that great picture in the Jim Henson biography of he and George Lucas working together on Labyrinth. And at some point when I was writing the Jim Henson book, I thought, God, that would be a great subject. George Lucas, it has to be the next one.
And, you talk about the biography of George Lucas being a largely archival project, even though you contacted people like Gary Kurtz. Now, can you talk a little bit about what your process was for gathering all of that information for the book? Because when you read it, like there's, note after note after note of where you got all this information from.
Well, again, then, there's a saying among biographers, which is that biographies are never finished as much as they're abandoned. And that's because we love doing the research and we love archives and we love digging through old newspapers. So like that density that I hope makes that book very rich, and that there's stories that even longtime Lucas fans and Star Wars fans read through and go, wow, I'd never heard that before, comes from that fun that you have digging through archives and archival documents and old newspapers. I did make a run at Lucas himself, and I actually got a note back from him telling me no, which people all sort of gasp at and say, wow, he usually never tells anybody anything, so you at least got to know. Yeah. Right. Part of the issue is that he was very unhappy with the Dale Pollock biography from 1983, and sort of vowed that he was never going to participate in any biography ever again. So I told Dale this in an email. I said, "Thank you, Dale. You ruined it for the rest of us." But and Dale's got the goods. I mean, like Dale knew him, interviewed him, so he's got the really great stories in the quotes from like his childhood section. But most of that book involves just like sitting down and just like digging through. Star Wars, of course, is a cottage industry. There's tons written on Star Wars. There's a lot written on Indiana Jones and things like that. And there's a lot written on a lot of people. So the great part about it is there's a lot of material out there that's even alongside Lucas. There's great dense books on Francis Ford Coppola and on Steven Spielberg, like all these people he knew. And there's great documentaries on people like John Milius. So there's lots and lots and lots of places to go for information. The biggest problem is almost what doesn't get in. So there's having enough information was never a problem. Now, I wouldn't have guessed that when it started, when I was like, well, he's not going to talk to me. Is this going to be tough? It actually wasn't. The guy talks way more than he thinks he does, and has been talking almost constantly since about 1965, 66. So
now, kind of this sidetrack a little bit, but since the book came out, have you heard anything from Lucas's camp? Did he read it? Or you still have nothing from them?
I have nothing from them. I don't know. I don't know. The fact that no attorneys have ever come knocking or threatened, Balance or not, or Little Brown, makes me believe I probably got it right. And I tend to not write takedowns of people anyway, so I don't really think there's anything in there that would upset him. He was apparently upset after the Dale Pollock biography. He didn't like the way Dale wrote about his relationship with Coppola, but the last 25, 30 years have only gone to prove even more so that Pollock got it right. Anyway, the fact that a very litigious company and a very litigious CEO have never come knocking, I think I probably did pretty well.
Well, yeah, because when you read the book, it's very fair and factual. There's really nothing that can be seen as like a sort of takedown of Lucas. It's just, this is the way he was and is. The way I try to work as a biographer is I leak through. People always were like, you're sympathetic or you're a fanboy, which is probably true enough. Right. But my preferred style of biography, and I've tried to do this with all of my biographies, is to kind of get out of the way and let them tell you the story. And so that's why I tried to be sure as often as I could you get Lucas's version of the events. Even if I don't think it's necessarily true, I at least want him to have his version in there before we then talk about it and pick it apart. So and you also said, I've been watching talks you've given and interviews you've given the past week to prep for this. So, you mentioned that the underlying theme of the book is, Lucas's need for control of whatever he's working on. Right. And you call him, or his way to get that, charming recklessness. And why is it that almost, that way of being, why did it almost always pay off for him?
Great question, and I wish I had a great answer for it. I mean, charming recklessness, I think, is a phrase my wife actually came up with as she was reading Dressing This, because it's one of the things she really loved about him. And I hadn't. When you can step back and see it through someone else's eyes, you're like, you're right. She's absolutely right. And why I call it that, and why she called it that, is because there are so many times in his life when he risks everything, and everybody around him is like, "What are you doing?" Whether it's telling his father to F off because, he's going to be a millionaire before he's 30 and doesn't want to run the family company, or taking all of his profits from American Graffiti and pouring it into this esoteric science fiction movie nobody understands. Right. And then taking all the profits from Star Wars and pouring it into the sequel, but also building his own, Disneyland there in Skywalker Ranch that nobody understands except for him. I mean, there's like so many times in his life that he is like very charmingly reckless.
Right.
And I think the reason he does pull it off is because, it's the same thing that cost him his marriage. It's eye on the ball.
Right.
It's that absolute commitment to the project he's working on, or projects, which is really astounding too. When I started laying out the timeline of Lucas's projects, there's times in his life when he's got a lot of balls in the air. If he's like, he's got one film that he's actually making, and then he's got another one in development, and then he's got another one that the script's out there, and there's something he's producing. I mean, the guy really has this incredible ability to focus, even in the midst of all these other things that are trying to pull his focus.
Right. And, you mentioned his marriage, and the book goes sort of in like a timeline of every time they were about to get settled and start a family, there'd be another project. There'd be another thing.
Another woman.
Right. And do you think his failure in that marriage later, really got his, for lack of a better term, crap together?
Yeah.
And you think that led him to becoming a great father to his now 4 kids?
Absolutely. I think it led him to being a great father, and I think it leads him to now being a great husband. And I think Melody Hobson has been a great influence, and I think she lightened him the hell up, for one thing.
Yeah. I
don't think you get him on, what is it, the Liquid Television or whatever it is, without her influence.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, he's at least astute enough, like we were saying, there's always another woman, and at one point the another woman is Empire, then again it's Return of the Jedi. There's always another one who's like pulling him away from Marcia, and finally her attention wanders elsewhere because Lucas isn't paying any attention to her.
Right.
What's so interesting is, he gets done with Jedi, and she, files for divorce, and he's stunned. And you're like, dude, why are you shocked? I mean, but I think maybe he thought she understood because, she has a filmmaking background and she knows how it works. So I think he was, I guess him being shocked is somewhat understandable, but I think it really woke him up. And that's why he does the ballsiest thing ever after Jedi is he essentially walks away for a decade.
Yeah.
He steps away even from Lucasfilm, which is pretty amazing, and then comes back again a little later, but actually steps away from Lucasfilm and begins raising his kids. And just the fact that by the time we get to the prequel trilogy, he will have his children on the set, I think speaks volumes for his evolution.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Probably, had all of that stuff not happened, when you look back, he probably would have, gotten himself sick again, just working, tooth and nail day in and day out. But it seemed like since he had, again, that complete control of the prequel trilogy, directing it, and pretty much nobody to tell him no, it was his vision,
Right.
The way that he wanted it, and he had the technology to do it. And, he pretty much was able to please himself and his family while doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's easy to crap on the prequels, and believe me, I was part of the problem for a while. But it's fascinating because it's sort of the parallel between he and Jim Henson is Jim loved that tech, and Lucas loves that tech, and having that digital filmmaking that he pioneered available to play with, it's almost like his attitude, especially by Attack of the Clones, is like to hell with everything. Like he's going to put it all on screen,
right?
And it doesn't matter if it muddies up the plot or whatever. Like he is just playing, and I cannot begrudge him that at all. It's his technology, it's his baby, and he is just having an absolute blast. I mean, for the first time ever, he's not breathing over John Dykstra's shoulder, like tapping his toes, being like, "Where are my effects?
Right.
At 300 days, what are you doing?" Like for the first time ever, he's like, we'll clean it up in post, and if we don't like the color of that drape, we'll fix that. I mean, he must have just loved it.
Oh yeah,
absolute control. Absolute control.
Right, and it's funny. I was watching the commentary he did for American Graffiti today, and again he mentions the studio taking the film away from editing out those 4 minutes, and he says in the commentary, apparently they felt that those 4 minutes either made it a great movie or a terrible movie. So whatever. And I'm like, yep, that's George.
It's so funny because between that one and THX, like that one was 4 minutes as well, and there's this something about 4 minutes he just goes apoplectic about. I mean, and fair enough. Like it's like he wants Final Cut, and they're not going to give him Final Cut. It's just because they can.
Right.
And of course it pisses him off. It should have.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would then lead him to pretty much taking his ball and saying, "All right, I'm just going to go do this myself." And then in '77 we get Star Wars, and there've been so many stories about, on set, how he was with the actors, the faster, more intense, the story of the how they casted Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher. And I wanted to ask you, how difficult or easy was it to find any information about the making of Star Wars that wasn't already widely known?
Um, First of all, there's those fantastic books that Rinsler's doing that are so helpful and have the storyboards. And what I thought was fascinating is Rinsler's working for Lucasfilm, so he's like a sanctioned project. And it's the first time they've ever gone sort of on the record, even though they tiptoe around it, of basically saying Lucas did not have it all planned out in advance. Like that's sort of the first time that's been canon, so to speak.
Right.
Usually Lucas is like, I knew from the start I had this all, and it's like, and they've let him get away with that. This is the first time that narrative has been pushed aside in something sanctioned by Lucasfilm. So the Rinsler books are fantastic on that sort of thing. There's always been great documentaries. I remember even as a kid, like reading Splinter of the Mind's Eye and then reading Dynamite magazine and having them talk about, or reading in some science fiction magazine, them talking about how Lucas, before Empire came out, was like, we're going to do another movie at some point, and it's going to take place before Star Wars, and it's going to be about Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader and Luke's father. And so, like, I always remember that conversation, which always shaped the way that I look at Lucas's narrative, because I've never forgotten that since I was, 10 years old. Lucas saying in the magazines at that time that he did not have it planned out. But as far as finding stuff that people, I'm sure someone's read everything in there before. I think the real task is to tell the story in a way that's fun and interesting and tells your story, like makes you understand why Lucas acts the way he does and why he becomes the way he does and the lessons he learns from making Star Wars. So, Star Wars is so great to write about. It's so much fun. And the one thing about it is it's so iconic that the John Baxter book that came out in like '99 or something. Every time he starts writing about a movie, he summarizes it. I'm like, dude, you don't have to summarize Raiders of the Lost Ark. We've all seen it.
Right.
And so it's like, and the great thing about Star Wars is like, I don't have to summarize it. So what was really fun for me was to go through and maybe tell you some things you didn't know about some of those very early plots, because we all know what the plot of Star Wars is. So it's so great having that relationship with readers where we're all in on it. And then, being able to like push little pieces out there. They're like, everything that you thought you knew didn't quite happen the way Lucas told us it happened. And let's look at that. So I think that was part of the fun of it, was not necessarily like, I'm going to tell you something brand new about Star Wars you haven't heard, but let's look at Lucas's narrative on making a Star Wars, and let's go back and look at what's really happening and why that shaped him, why he felt the need, why he felt compelled to shape this narrative on Star Wars, when we actually all know kind of what's happened.
Right, and it was really cool reading those very early drafts of the script, characters like Mace Windu and C.J. Thorpe, a Padawan, names that now you're like, those aren't Star Wars names, besides the eventual Mace Windu.
Right.
But it was so cool to read, because you just saw how each time it was also the fact, bleeding on the page, as he called writing a movie, writing, a page and then being like, okay, this isn't working, then writing another one and another one and another one. So that was a really interesting way to get into sort of how committed he was, but also annoyed probably at why he couldn't get this thing down as quickly as he might have wanted to.
Well, and the other thing that's stunning, it's like, what's the saying? It's like a dog walking on its hind legs, the fact that it happened at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you read those first drafts for Star Wars and you're like, what is going on? I mean, it's when I talk about Lucas, I always put up on the wall, and I have a snapshot or someplace of his actual handwriting. It's like the story of Mace Windu, and I put that up and I start reading it out loud. I'm like, how's everybody doing? Anybody interested, or are you already done? And like people start laughing because you read this opening lines of that, and you're like, this is so boring.
Yeah.
Thank God that he had Laddie there looking out for him, because I would have taken that script and tossed it over my shoulder. I wouldn't have gotten it. And Ladd's the one who's like, dude, try again. Keep coming back to this because that first draft is a disaster.
Yeah, just very like comical. You're like, what is this? What is going on here? And then ultimately,
it's Lucas like just like digging into like the backstory, world building, and like losing the plot.
Right.
He's so committed to that world building, which is kind of what he does by the time we get to the prequels. He's like really committed to that world building at that point. But in those first drafts of Star Wars, you were like, we don't need everybody's backstory. Let's get on with it. It's an absolute disaster and a fascinatingly bad disaster.
Yeah, and in the book, you talk about how the production for Star Wars had a lot of issues, whether it be the effects weren't coming in on time, Lucas getting sick. But then ultimately we know that the film changes the world. We don't remember a world without Star Wars at this point.
That's right.
And despite those issues, why do you think it ultimately succeeded? They pretty much were going against everything by the time the movie comes out. Why do you think they were able to just really hunker down, get it done, and deliver the product that we know today?
Well, again, it all comes down to, this was actually the working title, or the title I submitted the proposal for this book, and I called it The Force. And what I meant by that is that's Lucas. It's sheer force of will. I mean, Lucas was determined to run that thing into the end zone, no matter what it took. And that's why, he gets done, goes to ILM, and they have no effects. So, so he rides Dykstra to the finish line on that, and so it's Lucas's force of will to get this thing done. And then going through that disastrous preview with all of his friends when they don't understand it. And I'm trying to imagine seeing Star Wars without sound effects, with unfinished special effects and no music.
Yeah.
It's no wonder, Spielberg's the only one who walked out of there going, this is going to be great.
Right.
But Lucas is right. I mean, he even says later that without John Williams, the movies aren't half as good as they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think seeing those early drafts without finished special effects and no sound effects and things like that would have been tough. But Lucas can see it. Lucas believes in it. He's going to get it done. But the thing you got to love about Lucas is once he's done with it and pushes out, then he runs. Like he goes off to Hawaii and he does not want to hear about it. So, so thank God that it worked. But it was just the sheer force of will of Lucas that thing got done. And Marsha. I mean, again, the thing that's incredible about Lucas is he is such a control freak, but always seems to know the right people for the particular jobs. Even if he's going to, even if he's going to squat on them, he still kind of knows who the right people are for these things and knows when to ask for help. And even if he never gets beyond his USC mafia, he's still, he's asking Gloria Katz and, for help, and he's asking Coppola for input, and he's sitting doing casting with, not John Carpenter, is it? But
De Palma.
Brian De Palma, and Brian De Palma helps him with the opening crawl. So like he always seems to know when to ask for help, and he tends to know how to ask the right people for help, even as control oriented as he is.
Right. And one of the biggest laughs I got out of this book was when he showed that cut of Star Wars to Spielberg, De Palma, and those other people in the room. And when De Palma basically just loses his mind, Lucas's retort, you should talk. None of your films have made a dime. I lost my mind.
Exactly.
That's so funny.
And he's like, what is this force shit? But in the early drafts, it's called the force of others. Like it's very clunky. And so I think even having De Palma tear him a new one, he takes that to heart, and it makes it a better film. I mean, that's where you got to give Lucas credit. I mean, he is willing to listen to other people on it. He's not so dug, again, even as control oriented he is, he still doesn't ever dig in completely where he's willing to listen. He's willing to have De Palma say, this doesn't make sense. Let me rewrite the crawl for you.
Right.
Not everybody would do that.
Right. And also one of the more interesting parts of the book, getting into the birth of ILM and John Dykstra and those guys, what was it like to really dive into that story and see how all of these people came together and now they're icons in their field?
Yeah, and I mean, an ILM it always has been and continues to be the gold standard. I mean, it was always one of those things where, when you would see special effects by ILM, you were like, oh, great. It was like when you used to see, Jim Henson's Creature Shop. You're like, oh, great, the monster's going to look great.
Yeah.
What I didn't really realize until I started doing the research on this is I didn't realize that Lucas, was skeptical about farming them out. That he was ILM only did George Lucas movies, but you get to the point where George Lucas isn't doing movies anymore.
Right.
So then ILM does movies by George Lucas's friends, but it gets to the point where even George Lucas's friends can't make enough movies to keep them open. So that's when he goes out and starts doing Star Trek and all the, and then winning one Academy Award after another.
Right.
It was purely a business decision, which makes that, I think, even more interesting. That it's not this thing where like this creative outlet. It's like we got to keep the lights on, and the way you keep the lights on is you keep people hired by giving them jobs. And you put yourself out there as work for hire. I didn't realize that side of the story. Now I knew sort of peripherally the Pixar story is the one that got away, and found that story very interesting and actually kind of funny. I love that Lucas to this day still calls Pixar my company.
Yeah, and that's one thing about Lucas. He can forgive, but he'll never forget.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Yeah. And look at how pissed he was at Dykstra. He won't speak his name even, and and Dykstra walks away with one of the Oscars from Star Wars, and to this day still has no Academy Awards to his name. Dykstra's got one, Marsha's got one, he still doesn't have one.
Yeah, it really is amazing. It really is amazing. And then obviously Star Wars comes out, changes the world, and then as we were talking about earlier, he puts everything on Empire Strikes Back. And this year being the 40th anniversary of Empire.
That's right.
We know that obviously George didn't direct.
It makes me feel old. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, I'm sure my dad loves to hear that as well. So we know that George ultimately did not direct Empire Strikes Back, but pretty much directed Return of the Jedi. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think Empire would have been different had he directed that film? Because, as you read in the book, he was very annoyed with Irving Kershner and how he took his time getting things right instead of just, the regular way George would always shoot his movies. How do you think the tone of the movie, whether it be it would have been as dark as it was, or, the story, how do you think it would have been different?
I'm not sure the story would have been different because, again, that's another one. You read the early drafts that Lee Brackett turned in, and the final movie is very different. And that's, the fact that's oh God, you got to help me out. The guy who wrote Raiders.
Kasdan, Lawrence Kasdan.
That's Lawrence Kasdan impact there. Golly, the names all go away. So that's Kasdan. So I think script wise and story wise, you probably would have been the same. I think even with the same story though, with Lucas directing, the tone might have been different.
Yeah.
But I think part of it too is, Lucas and his faster, more intense. Kasdan, not Kasdan. I'm sorry. Kirsch is a actor's director.
Right.
Kirsch is the one who is like, and there's a fantastic, and the book that I used, it was this beat up little paperback on the making of The Empire Strikes Back. It's like this oral history. It's just like all these interviews with them, and you get these really great behind the scenes moments of like Kirsch talking with Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher and like them talking about ad-libbing those lines and dialogue and thinking things through. Harrison Ford's got the great line where he tells Lucas that you can write this shit, but you can't say it. I don't think he would have said that to Kirsch. Kirsch is the one who's like, okay, well then let's say something different.
Right.
Because he's going to work with the actors in that. So I think Kirsch, I think he's part of what makes Harrison Ford a better actor who then goes on to Indiana Jones and starts becoming a great actor. But I think even just working with Irving Kershner makes Harrison Ford a better actor and makes everybody else in the movie better actors. But it is about that pacing and that taking the time, and that's something that Lucas just would not have done. So with the who knows, the movie might have come in 7 minutes shorter even. Lucas,
yeah.
You might not have had some of these longer, more drawn out beats that you get, and Yoda with this delivery that's very halting and very deliberate. Who knows? You might have had Lucas being like, Frank, hurry it up. Let's
yeah.
hurry, you're burning clock.
Right, right.
So I don't, it's hard to say whether it would have changed story wise. I don't know, but I think he would have affected the tenor a little bit. It probably would have been a little faster and more intense.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Empire.
What do you think?
I think just because of the way those romantic scenes in the prequels turned out, and obviously it's a different story two different kinds of characters interacting. But you look at the dialogue, for example, in Attack of the Clones, in that, the scene where Anakin and Padme are by the fireplace, and when I see that, I'm like, is this just because he's focusing so much on the technical aspects of the film that he's not really giving this moment the direction it needs, or maybe touching the script up a little bit? Whether that would have played in Empire with the scenes between Han and Leia, having someone like Kirshner there encouraging, Harrison to say, just whatever comes to your mind, say it with the "I love you, I know." Right. I imagine Lucas probably would have wanted that to be, something of when Anakin and Padme go out into the arena in Geonosis. It's like this, "I truly, deeply love you," instead of just kissing and going out there. You know?
Yeah. No. Good. Very good point.
But obviously, Empire turned out to be now probably the greatest Star Wars movie that we have. And Jedi, you started to get the sense of Lucas and what was ultimately coming with the prequels. Just kind of a more goofier gags that I noticed in that movie. But as we jump to the prequels, obviously he is into the technology. He has what he needs now to make those stories. But he revolves himself around yes men, basically, that really don't want to tell him no.
Right.
And it's weird because in the original trilogy, he had those people that said, okay, maybe we should do this differently. Maybe we should go this direction with it. How do you think that trilogy would have been different had he had those people around him? With the story, I think the story would have probably stayed around the same, but maybe it would have been trimmed around the edges. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think I think the power of having people who are willing to push back. Gary Kurtz's presence is felt in its absence in Jedi.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason that both Star Wars and Empire, even the fact that you've got different directors, have this, I think, cohesiveness to them, because you've got sort of the same showrunner, if you will,
right.
Babysitting these things all the way through and going in on bended knee and getting them more money and so on. I think he needed somebody like a Gary Kurtz by the time you get to the prequels, because first of all, the problem he doesn't have by the time he gets to the prequels is money's not an issue. And it's like, his frustration with both Star Wars and mostly Star Wars, but even in Empire, is like, it doesn't look the way he wants because the studio suits won't give him the money he needs. He doesn't have that problem now with this one. He can do whatever he wants, because he can do it all in post, as they say. I mean, he doesn't have to actually build a new model. He can just do it all in CGI. So I think where you need somebody like Gary Kurtz is to get in there and just be like, don't put so much crap on screen. Stop bothering the eye, and let's hunker down on the story here. And, and there's Lucas interested in the world building and in the technology, and you even sort of see it in Radioland Murders. It's like he's like the plot just goes away in that movie,
right?
And Lucas isn't even directing that, but that's like him playing with the technology. Is the technology going to work? He's much more interested in working that part of it out. So I think he's just having so much fun with that tech and with that world building. He didn't really have anybody to sit on him and just say, up here, focus. This, and can you cut that out? And are you having problems with the the romantic side of this story here? And what can we do about that? Take a page out of Kirsch's book. Can we slow this down? Can we have the actors ad lib? I get the impression Lucas hates when people ad lib, even though he thinks that his own scripts suck.
Yeah.
I get the impression he's like, read what I have on the page and don't mess around.
Right.
So I think the fact that Lucas could do whatever he wants is part of the problem with the prequels. They have parts about them that are great, and they have parts about them that are just a slog. I think had you had a runner who was writing him, who would have just said, you've got to focus. You need to focus here. I think it might have made the movie tighter, and they would have discarded some of the underbrush in the plot. You probably still would have had some of the goofy stuff, like you were saying. Lucas's, the seams are showing even in Jedi, because I think partly because he's so toyetic at that point.
Right.
And I think that's a little bit of a concern, or I think that's on his mind a bit with Phantom Menace, as well as the merchandising. Right. I love the line where he says there was no money in dead Han toys.
Yeah.
So Anyway, that was a 20-minute way of saying yes. I think you're absolutely right. He needed a no man with him as well.
Right, right. And you just mentioned no dead Hans. That they wouldn't have made any money, and that's true. But it's really funny when you get into that conversation that he and Lawrence Kasdan had about oh, I think Han Solo should sacrifice himself midway through the movie, and Lucas is like, no, I don't want. Nobody has to die in this movie.
This is for kids. This is for kids.
Right. And then, he makes the joke of Luke putting on the mask and saying,
That's the part that I love.
Yeah.
That's the part I love. And Kessin's like, yeah, that's what should happen. That should totally happen.
Right. and do you think that his want for that, fairy tale ending, and you have them celebrating on Endor with the Ewoks and all that stuff, do you think that movie could have been served well with whether it be a Han sacrifice or something that really elevated the stakes rather than just the ultimate, face-off between Luke and Vader? Or was Lucas just always for that happy ending at the end of the movie?
I don't know. I think, the whole hero with 1,000 faces thing that Lucas likes to talk about is ex post facto again. He didn't... Right. Like, he rolled into that by the time Empire comes around and starts embracing some of that. I think part of what Lucas was trying to do from day one with Star Wars, I think fairy tale is very much in its DNA.
Yeah.
Fairy tale is its roots. That's where Lucas started. He wanted to have, he has the great quote where he talks about how television was full of, bad cops and, things like that. And he wanted, this generation to have their own mythology. They didn't have knights in shining armors. They didn't have cowboys. They didn't have war movies. All they had to look at now was bad cops on TV. This is their mythology. Right. So I think Lucas's heart is in the right place with this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the fairy tale ending, or that happily ever after, and everyone's dancing and celebrating. It's like with Shakespeare. Every comedy ends with a wedding.
Right.
For Lucas, the fairy tale is going to end with Han getting the girl, and everybody dancing. And so I think it's actually not a cop-out. I think it's very true to its original DNA, its original roots. I think that's very much Lucas's sensibility showing there.
Right. And, looking back at Return of the Jedi, honestly, I'm glad he didn't make that choice, because it would have been like, okay. I mean, it feels like it would have just been done, for dramatic effect, but also just to do it and kind of shock the audience a little bit, because Lucas, as you said, he is for that, those happy endings, even though we see Anakin get chopped up at the end of Revenge of the Sith, but right. Now,
except we know where that one's going.
Right.
Think about how first of all, you weren't alive, but like people were so pissed. People were so pissed when Empire ended on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Had Lucas taken Gary Kurtz's advice, and it would have been a hell of a story, and ended Empire with like Han dead, Leia assembling the alliance to be more permanent, and Luke going off as like the lone gunslinger. Right. I mean, that's really cool. But as a fan, I would have been pissed at that end.
Yeah.
Because as far as we knew, that was it.
Right. That's true. That's very true. It almost seems like that's the kind of movie that, although I love The Last Jedi, that's the kind of movie Rian Johnson would have made had he done Empire or Jedi or any one of them.
Well, it's so funny, and the irony on it, it's like I love watching the response to Last Jedi, because after The Rise of Skywalker came out, everyone's like, oh my God, Last Jedi is such a great movie. And I was like, 25 seconds before this movie came out, you were all shitting on it.
Yeah.
Which is what happened with Empire. Everybody's like, Empire's a downer, so and now it's pretty much universally it's the greatest. I think the same thing will happen with Last Jedi. Everyone's like, there was the vision.
Right.
That was where they should have yanked the wheel in that direction. Right. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Rian Johnson was like sort of paying homage to that direction. Mm-hmm. And I just saw I didn't actually read the script, but I saw the little quick summary of A Duel of the Fates. And I was like, that's pretty awesome and pretty dark. And I probably would have been okay with that too. But yeah, I mean, I'm not one of these haters on Rise of Skywalker. I think I walked away satisfied, but then I'm old. I'm like Generation 1. I'm Gen X on this one. I just wanted to see how it ended because I'm tired.
Right.
I was
That's
fine.
a great way to put it.
Yeah, I was fine with it. But, everyone's like, well, it's fan service. And I was like, well, it's fan service for my generation. So, of course, I'm good with it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's Ryan Johnson he's Irvin Kershner with that one. And he's going to he put it all up on the wall. I think Last Jedi is fantastic. And a lot of great ideas. I mean, the idea in there that I love, which they dismiss, is that, Luke's got that great line about how the Force doesn't belong to the Jedi. It belongs to everyone. Because that was the thing that made me the angriest with the prequels, was when Lucas comes up with this pseudoscientific bullshit to explain.
Yeah.
That's what always made me so crazy, because I was like, so therefore Han Solo's screwed. Like, he couldn't knuckle down and apply himself and to figure out how to become one with ways of the Force, because he's just not genetically predisposed to that. That really made me insane.
Yeah. It's his want to then, start explaining everything. And there's a reason why these things are this way and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I don't know where the urge to do that came from. And then, didn't you love him? There was he was saying, well, if they would have followed my script for the sequel trilogy, we would have got into the micro world with oh my God, I can't say it all of a sudden, with the Mylocoridians, blah. I can't. Yeah. Anyway, he was just going on about how they would have done the microscopic role. It's like, what is this?
Yeah.
This is the craziest idea ever.
Yeah. And, it's funny. I actually wanted to talk to you about the sequel trilogy. Now that we know how the story ends, we know who directed each film, despite all the issues that were surrounding productions like Solo and Rogue One. Do you think, had Lucas been involved in these films, would he have been okay with letting guys like J.J. Abrams, Ryan Johnson, and in my opinion, I feel like he would have, because J.J. is like a protege to Spielberg. He's very much the same kind of filmmaker. From what I understood with the Last Jedi documentary, he was very happy with The Last Jedi and what Ryan Johnson did. Yeah. And he's been on the set of Solo and The Mandalorian now. So had he been involved, and who knows, maybe he was more than they're letting on, but had he been involved in that capacity, how do you think he would have managed to, try to keep his hands off of everybody?
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint with this, because it's like, this is like a parlor game with this. It's like, I'm just not sure. It's like, he admires and was sort of a protege for Ron Howard, and I think Solo's a mess. So, it's hard to know, because he handed over the keys to Star Wars and then immediately wanted them back.
Yeah.
It was like, I don't know whether he lost confidence or he, got bored and then realized that he was going to be really bored not having Star Wars to do. And so that's why he wanted to come back to it. So I don't know what it would have looked like had he been doing it. I mean, the narrative arc I love on this is, it's like, after the prequel trilogies are done, we, the fans, are bitching that George Lucas should never be allowed near Star Wars ever again. All he's doing is goofing around. He's world building, blah, blah, blah. It's lost sight of what Star Wars. Phantom Menace not Phantom Menace. God dang it. What's episode 7 all of a sudden?
Force Awakens.
Force Awakens comes out. Everyone's like, that is so derivative. They need to bring George Lucas back to do Star Wars.
Yeah.
Well, 10 minutes before that came out, he was like, they need to keep him as far away from Star Wars as possible. The same thing happened with Ryan Johnson. Keep him as far away from Star Wars as possible with The Last Jedi. Then as soon as the episode 9 comes out, everyone's like, oh, Ryan Johnson's a brilliant filmmaker.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, would Lucas have been as indulgent with the sequel trilogy? It's hard to tell. I mean, what's the span of years now since, it would have been 10 years since Sith and Force Awakens, separating the two of them. So I don't know. Is there enough growing up? I don't want to say that exactly, but enough growing up, enough life experiences coming around that he might tell that more mature story, or was he going to go down into the micro universe and start giving us the story of the midichlorians? I mean, is that where he was going to go? Because I really don't want to see that movie. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, again, I'm horribly disappointed because I really can't answer that. I just don't know, because Lucas got really pissed at Hollywood, and I don't think it had anything to do with the fan response to the prequels, it was Red Tails.
Mm-hmm.
He was really pissed at Hollywood after Red Tails and how they blew him off and they didn't respect him as a filmmaker and they wouldn't send people, to watch it and to review it. That's the moment I think he says "F this" and walks away.
Yeah.
So I think he felt he had lost his mojo, that it just wasn't any fun anymore. Had he had that mentality and then gone into an episode 7, 8, 9 arc at that point, I don't know. He might have been pissed enough at that point that it might have been this very dark arc. I just don't know.
Right. We could have gotten a Temple of Doom like resurgence in Star Wars with somebody. You find Palpatine and you just chop his head off again or something.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So I don't know. I know that's a horribly disappointing answer because I've thought about it and I really don't know. I run into that with Jim Henson. People are like, what would Jim think of this? What would he do with this? And, the best answer I can come with is, I don't know. And that's what made him Jim Henson. It's like he would think of something we hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
And kind of the way Lucas is. Like he would have probably thought of something we would have been like, oh, okay, well, that's different. Whether you like it or not is another question. But like he never gives you something uninteresting. I mean, you got to give him credit for that.
Oh, right. And I think a lot of the goodwill that fans are having towards him, in the last several years, is one, the Clone Wars enriching that prequel era, and Dave Filoni. I think Dave Filoni is, a lot of people call him the heir apparent to George, and I don't know if you've seen it today, but the newest episode of the Clone Wars, it's a movie. They put up the original green Lucasfilm logo before the episode started, and it was incredible, and everybody lost their minds on Twitter. Reactions to the episode went up on YouTube within hours. It was nuts.
See, that's Lucas again, knowing the right person for the job, which, as we said earlier, he's always been able to do, even with as big a control freak as he is. He's always able to pick the right person for the job on that. And damn it if he didn't do that with Dave Filoni.
Yeah. And I really hope that at some point he can really direct his own movie, because that guy just has so many great ideas, and I think he really understands just what is so engrossing about Star Wars. Not saying that any of the filmmakers that have made any movies in this era now with Disney haven't, but I think he just has this way of giving you such a rich story that I really, really like.
Well, and he's picked an era in the Star Wars story that was like completely unplumbed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that's one of the things I always say about Lucas is, where you really need to give him credit is he established the ground rules for this gigantic universe with this gigantic mythology. It's like, Marvel Comics. Like we sort of know the rules of the universe for Marvel, and then you can go anywhere in it.
Yeah.
Lucas really did that with the Star Wars universe. It is the metaphor he always uses. He has this gigantic sandbox he has given people to play in.
Mm-hmm.
And Filoni is just having a blast in it. And I got to say, I was actually impressed with The Mandalorian because I've said this elsewhere too. I'm not a Boba Fett fetishist.
Yeah.
And when I heard like the Mandalorian, and I was like, oh, God, I don't need more of this. I don't need Boba Fett backstory. So, without really knowing what it was about at that time. But I was like, I just was not into it.
Mm-hmm.
Jon Favreau just gets it.
Yep.
It's just it was really impressive, and like this very quiet series. Like it's very small in a way. It's a very intimate series. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and again, Jon Favreau is somebody who worked with George on the Clone Wars as another Mandalorian character. So, those guys there, they really understand what makes it really hit with people. And I'm so excited for the second season.
You see what they're doing? They're doing what Irvin Kershner is. They're taking their time.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. They're letting stuff spread out a little bit, which again, that's not Lucas's natural inclination, but he's got Filoni at the helm who was doing this, and he's got Favreau there. So I think again, that's part of his legacy of moving forward is he at least got the right people in the right jobs. He knows how to do that.
Right. And before we get into our last couple questions here, I want to ask you, surrounding himself with the right people, whether it be Francis Ford Coppola being one of his oldest friends, Steven Spielberg. What is it about that group of friends that he's had throughout his life that's that through line in his career? Is it people that just keep him on track, or just people that he really likes and doesn't mind helping? Because that's another thing. Anybody asks him for help, and more often than not, he'd be like, "Yeah, sure."
Yeah, I mean, Marsha's got that great line where she says something like, he made friends in college and that was about it for him. Like he never never had to make any more beyond that. And
Right.
And then he sort of widens the circle a little bit when they get into Zoetrope. But I mean, that's one of the charming and interesting parts of the story too. Is like when Spielberg comes along, he's not welcome with open arms initially because he's not at USC.
Mm-hmm.
He's where was he? Northridge, Long Beach, or something.
Yeah.
I can't remember, but he's not welcomed into the circle right away because Lucas has already got this very tight knit circle around him of people who like speak that same language he does and know the same references he does. It's like nowadays you always talk about people find their tribe. Lucas sort of found his tribe in 1966 and stayed with them,
Right.
and is fiercely loyal to them and really respects it. And it really is interesting. What is it? John Milius says he compares them to the West Point class, the one that they said the class the stars fell on because all these famous generals came out of like this 2-year bracket. That kind of happened at USC Film School. Like that's the reason everybody goes to USC now is because you go back and look at like that 1968 through 72 bracket there.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there's people go to USC Film School, and then the reason it's such a great school now is because Lucas has dumped so much money back into it. So I think it just goes to again Lucas's need to it's not even necessarily control. It's almost this sense of being content.
Yeah.
Like Lucas has this group of friends. They were there with him in the early days. They were there with him through thick and thin. They believed in him. They understood him. They gave him honest feedback on these films he was doing, and they helped him punch up scripts for American Graffiti when it needed it, and they helped him find money, and they gave him jobs. Coppola's got him editing parts of The Godfather when Lucas needs a job, and you've got Scorsese who's given Marsha jobs while Lucas is trying to sell Star. They're all this very tight-knit circle of friends.
Yeah.
And that's the age, it's like the friends that I made when I was in my 20s. I mean, we were all working in a congressional office together, which is not quite the same thing. But like we always joke about how that was our Vietnam. So even to this day, 25 years later, it's this very tight knit group of people still of all sorts of different like political persuasions and different, but it's like still this tight group. And I think that's the way it is with Lucas. It's like these friends he made in college who spoke the language he did. They just sort of had each other's backs early on, and those are the bonds that stay. And again, you get people that move into the circle, Ron Howard and Lawrence Kasdan, and you have people that come to be able to speak to Dave Filoni that speak that language and get it.
Right.
But I think it's rarefied air. That's a privileged place to be. You've got to work your way in and earn your way into that circle.
Yeah, absolutely. And those stories of him interacting with Coppola and Spielberg and that friendly competition with Spielberg and also that really brotherly relationship with Coppola was really one of the parts of the book that I enjoyed because it was just really cool to see every time there was sort of a point of contention between him and Coppola. It was just funny to see what it was about as they got older.
Exactly. Well, the bit I love with them is it's Coppola who tells Lucas, very early on, you need to learn how to write. Mm-hmm. You're a good director. You're an excellent editor, but you need to learn how to write. No one will take you seriously as a director if you can't write. So Lucas, who hates writing, goes on to create 2 gigantic, iconic, original universes.
Yeah.
What does Coppola do? He makes his name directing adaptations of other people's work. Mm-hmm. Like Coppola's doing The Godfather and The Outsiders and all this other stuff. Like he doesn't really. He does his original screenplays early, and then he never really does them again.
Right.
So I just love that. Like that was like a do as I say, not as I do from Coppola, which is what the older brother does to the younger brother.
Right.
But,
right.
A really great relationship. I love the relationship with Spielberg, and it almost like. When I watch the video of it, it almost chokes me up when Lucas gets the award I think from Spielberg. I think it's at the AFI.
Yeah.
And he says he talks about, he thanks Spielberg, and he says, my friend, and then he says my competitor, which is actually lovely. That they know they have that kind of a relationship, that they make each other. It's like Lennon and McCartney.
Yeah.
You hear somebody write it. Lennon writes a song, and Paul's like, "Well, I'm going to one up that because that's a great song, and I want John, his acceptance because that's a great song. I want him to know I can do it." I think Lucas and Spielberg are like that. They're Lennon and McCartney. It's like they're trying to impress and outdo each other. It's a great relationship in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that relationship, we know now, obviously due to this whole coronavirus thing, that Indiana Jones 5 is being pushed, I think, to 2022.
Well, Harrison Ford.
I think he's still gonna be in it, although whether he's gonna be doing all his crazy stunts, and going in the jungle with monkeys like he did in Crystal Skull, who knows? But do you think that we could see George kind of dipping his toes again into Indiana Jones?
I think so. Now, you might know this better than me because I tend to get this one confused when I talk about it. Yeah. Who actually owns Raiders? That didn't necessarily go into Disney because like Universal had, or like Warner, who had that one?
I think Paramount had Indiana Jones. And it's funny you bring that up because it's under the Lucasfilm umbrella, but it's not on Disney Plus. It's not on any of their owned platforms. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, who's got it? I don't actually know.
Yeah.
But I don't know how I feel about having Harrison Ford coming back at age 84 at this point or something.
Yeah, he's getting up there.
I'm not going to necessarily buy it. I kind of bought it last time. I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to buy him, swinging around on the whip and not breaking a hit.
Yeah.
I actually thought it was kind of cool when they had the idea of doing a reboot, and the name they throw around was Chris Pratt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could get behind Chris Pratt as Indiana Jones. I couldn't get behind Mutt.
Right.
Which you could see them going with that, which I think was a nod to Indiana being the dog, and so he was Mutt, the dog. So they were like, it was all a nod and a wink to that.
Right.
But I wasn't that high on him. I think partly it's because I'm not a big fan of that actor. But but so I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you continue to carry on with Indiana Jones with Harrison as Indy, just because it's so hard to buy him with doing all that daring do now that you kind of out of Indiana. Now, some of the original pitches, when you hear Lucas talking about Indiana Jones, he's like, well, he uses his brains more than his fists, although he can use his fists. I'd be like, okay, it's almost like you could almost do it like, like Oracle from, Batgirl or whatever. Like, behind the scenes guy now. And he's the one solving all the puzzles and doing all the archaeology stuff and doing that and like advising people. But I don't know. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And I just looked it up. He's 77, so by the time 2022 comes around, he'll be nearing 80.
Yeah.
So I really don't know.
Where he was when Sean played his father. So.
Yeah. So it's going to be 4 years this year since this book came out, and obviously a lot's happened in those 4 years with the wrapping up of the Skywalker saga, Rogue One, Solo. The resurgence of Clone Wars, 2 new animated series, all that stuff. And obviously all this stuff has happened since the book has been written, but what part of these, moments in Lucasfilm's history and Disney's history now would you really like to dive into? And maybe if you could write an extension to this book, what would you like to find out about George's thoughts, whether it be on the sequel trilogy or the animated stuff?
So the hardest part with, writing the new parts of the story, and it's always hard writing about a living subject. Someone was asking me about that. If you watch some of the stuff I was doing recently, I was, the example I always use, I say it's like the goalposts are constantly moving when your subject is still alive. So the hard part is if I would go back, like if he would die, God forbid, if he would die tomorrow and I had to go back and was going to like write a final chapter, the hard part is like trying to keep it Lucas centric.
Right.
Because it's very easy to start letting Star Wars spin away from you because there's so much cool stuff and so much other stuff has gone on. But you have to kind of like keep it in what it looks like from where Lucas is standing.
Right.
So that's where you have to. I think you look at probably his involvement with the Clone Wars, the Mandalorian. You can look at sort of the rumor mill on was he on set on some of the what maybe we'll hear more about how involved he really was, and a little bit about maybe getting rid of Rian Johnson or Colin Trevorrow.
Yeah.
But the hardest part is keeping the camera on him. Because a big part of what he's been doing the last couple of years actually is that Lucas Museum. That's what really pulled his attention, and I think that's where part of his actual joy is right now. Is in overseeing. They built Skywalker Ranch. That's done. This is his next big project like that. I mean, it's he always has to have a Monticello, like a never-ending architecture project going on.
Right.
And I think that museum will be that now that they finally landed in L.A. right there near USC. Surprise, surprise. And helping cultivate that relationship with the city, and then getting the archives in there, and so I think that's part of what's really fun for him. That's actually the big controversy when I was finishing that book up in 2015, early 16, was like we still didn't know where it was going to end up. So between the hardcover and the paperback, it landed in LA. So like the book got updated for that. But that story, I think I would still continue to follow a little bit because that's sort of his day to day.
Right.
And Star Wars, chugs along without him. So I think part of what I'd have to find out is where his finger's still touching Star Wars. Because again, I could write 5 more chapters all about Star Wars.
Yeah.
But you've got to keep it on him. And that's really the hardest part of writing about him, is because so much of the work and the work that's even work adjacent to him is so interesting and so much fun. So as a biographer, you gotta reel that back in and keep it on your subject.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, Brian, you did an amazing job writing this book, because I honestly, I had trouble sleeping last night, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to finish this book. It was 3 a.m. I read 100 pages, and I was like, it didn't even feel like 100 pages to me, because it was written that well.
I'm glad you read it to keep awake instead of go to sleep. So
yeah. But this obviously hasn't been the last book you've done. You wrote a book on Dr. Seuss that came out last year, and I wanted to ask you.
Paperback will be out next month.
Yes, and I'm definitely going to pick that one up as well. And I wanted to ask you, what figure do you want to write about next, or are you keeping that close to the chest right now?
No, I don't know, and that it's frustrating to me because it's the first time in 14 years maybe that I haven't known what my next subject is. It's both a pleasure and a curse. I don't know what the actual phrase is on that. That I tend to gravitate toward sort of big subjects that are iconic, but those subjects tend to get done. So it's hard to find those that I'm interested in that haven't been done or done recently, or that someone is at work on. I always have a lot of people tell me with the books I've written, you should do Mr. Rogers. Well, he was actually just done like 3 years ago. Maxwell King did.
Yeah.
You should do Steven Spielberg. Yeah. Joseph McBride wrote a gigantic book for like the University of Mississippi Press. It's like bigger than even my Jim Henson book. Or Lucas is 603 pages, something like that.
Yeah.
And the Spielberg book is like 800 or something. And I think someone's actually working on one with him now. So anyway, the hard part is finding a subject that feels like it's still in your lane,
right,
on your shelf, as my editor told me. When I was after the Lucas book got done, before I knew I was going to do Dr. Seuss, we were still casting about for subjects. And I had mentioned, I said, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years, and I'm not afraid of doing politics. If I could do a president or I could do a politician. And my editor looks at me and he goes, well, that takes you off your shelf. And I hadn't realized until that moment that I actually had a shelf.
Yeah.
And Dr. Seuss, firmly belongs on that shelf as well. So it's finding another name that's sort of along the lines of those. And that's actually very hard to do. The book that I would love to do, and it will never happen, as I'm a huge Beatles nerd, even though they were
Mhm.
before I was born. And I would like no one's ever really done Ringo, but
Yeah,
that's
that's true.
but everyone's like, no one's gonna read Ringo, and I'm like, I would read Ringo, and Miner's like, okay, you would, Brian, but come on.
Yeah. I think a book on Ringo Starr would be fantastic. I'm also a huge Beatles fan myself.
I think it would be too. The one thing I have heard is somebody was telling me jokingly, they're like, well, I'm a music journalist, and I've interviewed Ringo. He doesn't remember anything since about 1879. So,
Oh, that's funny.
I'm like, okay, well, fair enough.
Well, Brian, I want to tell you thank you so much for coming on tonight, man. I really appreciate it.
No, this is so great. I'm glad you. I appreciate you asking. I'm glad we made this happen.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, before I let you go, where can people purchase the book? Where can people find you online and all that good stuff?
Sure. You can buy all my books are still in print. You can get them from your favorite bookseller, both online or bricks and mortar. You can find me running my mouth on Twitter at Brian J. Jones. Just spell it all out, BrianJayones. If you just look for Brian Jones online, you'll get 300 pages of the Dead Rolling Stones. So be sure you put my middle name in there. Run on my mouth on Twitter at that, and that's also I think on Facebook. I'm so bad at Facebook, but I think it's official Brian J. Jones is my Facebook one. I do have an Instagram, but I never give that out because I suck at Instagram. So.
As do I. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. This was our conversation with Brian J. Jones, the author of George Lucas, A Life. If you have not read it yet, please, you have time. Just get it online. You have the time to read it. And I guarantee you'll be done with it in like a day or two because it's that good. So thank you, Brian, once again for coming on, and hope to talk to you soon. And for you guys at home, may the force be with you always.